Today we're going to talk about how the American Air Force inflicted the dubious delights of keg beer on an unsuspecting British public. Now, this all came around from the war years. When America came into the war in the 1940s, the American Air Force, the USAAF, came across to Britain, which they thought was an unsinkable aircraft carrier. And a lot of their air bases were around about East Anglia area. And they brought across their large four-engined Flying Fortress bombers. They were pretty confident that they would knock the Luftwaffe out of the sky with these well-armed bombers they had. Unfortunately for them, it transpired that the Luftwaffe hadn't read the script and started shooting them out of the sky. Now, there wasn't a lot the American Air Force could do at that time, but one of the things that they promised their boys was that as soon as their bombers came back from a raid, quite often badly shot up, a jeep would bump across the airfield and bring their boys a beer. The boys almost demanded it, you know. Now, the only problem with that was, with traditional British ale, if you bumped it across an airfield on the back of a jeep, by the time it got to the aircraft, it was fairly much undrinkable. Now, the thing was, the Americans thought Britain was kind of quite quaint, you know, and they liked our women, who were very accommodating, especially if you had nylon stockings or a few packets of cigarettes. They weren't so keen on our beer. They thought it was flat and warm, because across in the States, they'd long since been accustomed to drinking carbonated beer that was fizzy. The fact they gave you the Boken piles was neither here nor there. So the forceful USAAF Air Force General Curtis LeMay, started asking around and saying, hey, we like your bottled beer, but the problem was there was a bottle shortage during the war. So, you know, bottles weren't getting produced. Bottled beer tended to be carbonated beer. And they asked, why can't we have this carbonated, fizzy, bottled beer in cask? And it was explained to them that the extra pressure of the carbonation would blow the staves out of traditional British cooperage. And he said, well, what about we get, can't we put this into metal kegs? And he went to the largest brewery, which was close to where the American air bases were, which was J.W. Green's of Luton, which later became part of Flowers Breweries. And they said, well, it wouldn't really be possible to do that. It costs too much money to change our cask stock. And he said, well, how much money? They said, oh, at least £100,000. This was big money in that period, in the 1940s. Immediately, Uncle Sam pulled out a very large checkbook and wrote a check for £100,000. I don't know if they could convert that into dollars or not, but whatever, and said, get yourself metal kegs. Well, this solved this problem, but it didn't really solve the long-term problem of what the flyers in the US Air Force actually wanted, which was escort fires. Finally, by about 1944, the US Air Force had got themselves a couple of pretty good fighter planes, and by using them with drop tanks, could go and escort bombers right into Germany, particularly the Mustang fighters, which of course had a Rolls-Royce engine by then. And pretty quickly they started knocking the Luftwaffe out of the sky. Now, at the Nuremberg trials, Hermann Goering said that when he saw single-engined American fighters over Berlin, he realized the war was irretrievably lost. But the problem with this was it left a legacy, because after the war, various people thought, hey, this keg beer isn't such a bad idea. The fact that it was probably of a lower quality than traditional British ale didn't really matter to the sort of people who started coming into the UK after the war. Now, the Canadian mogul Eddie Taylor, E.P. Taylor, came from Canada. He was a Carling lager magnate, you know, and he thought what we really needed across here was Carling lager. Now, he came across and looked at the overcapacitated, undercapitalized, fragmented British brewing industry and started buying up breweries hand over fist. In a lot of cases, the owners of these breweries, which had been around for several hundred years in some cases, were only too pleased to bite his hand off when he came in and made good offers for them, because they'd had the hard interwar years when things had been pretty tough right across the board. And no investment had gone into a lot of the brewery companies for quite a long period of time. Now, his sidekick, Bernard Dixon, bought a small brewery, or utilized a small brewery in South Shields called the Westow Brewery to try and break keg beer into the mainstream British market. Talking to an old friend of mine many years ago, he said it was the worst stuff he ever drank. But the point was, they'd come to the conclusion that it didn't matter how awful the product was, if you heavily advertised it enough, the louse and the gullible, would buy it. So by the 1960s, things were coming to a peak. A lot of very fine brewery companies, which had been taken over in the preceding few years, just were basically closed, because if your beer that you're trying to punt is inferior to what they were brewing, the simple solution was you close all these breweries. So you've got to drink the stuff they want you to drink, however poor it was. I mean, does anybody ever remember Guards Heavy? It was so awful that even Ouija's noticed it was rotten. So anyway, that's why we had the dubious delights of keg being inflicted on us, and right through the 70s and 80s and right to the present day, there are these beers on the market that heavily advertised, but that you wouldn't wash your windows with.